Namaste, everyone. Welcome to the Cārvāka podcast. This is your host, Kushalmehra. All right. So, on if I remember the date correctly, yeah, it was February 24th, 2022 was the date when Russia launched a full-scale invasion on Ukraine. And for the ones who don't know, I think the Russo-Russian conflict has been going on, if my memory serves me correctly, from 2014. So I thought it's been more than a year since the official invasion of Ukraine. So to talk about it, I reached out to Velina. Velina is a geopolitical expert, and she has more than 20 years of experience, and she's been on the podcast before too. So Velina, thanks for coming and welcome.
Thank you for the invitation, Kushal. It's great to be back. We have so much to unpack.
So let's start over here. So now what we can officially say, it's been more than 15 months. Where are we at? If I was to give you the most simplistic version, who won, who lost, what's going on?
Yeah. So first, you rightly pointed out the full-scale invasion began on the 24th of February last year. Before that, we had already military operation, really highly complex one, facilitated and instrumentalized by Russia. And its operation was ongoing since the last 8 years in the eastern parts of Ukraine, in, let's say, around one-third of the territories of Donbass and Luhansk. Just to give you a perspective, currently there is around 90% being controlled by Russia of Luhansk, around 50% of Donetsk. And then we move also to the south and have also Russian control of further two territories, not to the fullest, but further two territories, which are Zaporizhia and Kherson. In Zaporizhia, we have also the largest nuclear plant, which is under Russian control. But of course, here we have the risk of also, let's say, nuclear explosion in the case of ongoing fights on the battlefield. So all in all, around 17% of the territory of Ukraine is currently under Russian control. But the war is also currently in a static, let's say, a static mode. And we are awaiting the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Why are we awaiting it? Because, well, weather was really, really bad and has been bad for the last several weeks. And we know for a fact, so long as it is raining and so long as you have like these really, really bad conditions on the ground, on the battlefields, Ukraine cannot start the counteroffensive. Why is this counteroffensive being awaited by both Russia and, of course, by the Ukrainian population, by the Ukrainian government? Is that it will, of course, precede, let's say, probably the first rounds of talks, of real official talks between Ukraine and Russia. The window of opportunity will be in the next, let's say, 3 to 6 months, because starting with November, there will be a very, very big political pressure from outside, specifically from the United States, but also in general from the West, for, let's say, for an avenue of political dialogue. United States will enter political campaign for presidential elections. Russia will also enter such election campaign. The presidential election is set for the 17th of March next year, and Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin is obviously eager to run as a presidential candidate. And then we have also presidential election for the European Parliament in 2024, which means also that a lot of governments here in the West are still in this kind of political, let's say, political turbulence with certain realities happening also on the ground when it comes to populist movements, right wing, left wing candidates, and so on and so forth. So that's why 3 to 6 months window of opportunity for Ukraine to create facts on the ground, to achieve military victories, and to push then for, like I said, a better outcome at the negotiation table. Now, if you ask, because this is your question, and this is final remark on my side, of course, from Russia's perspective, 17% of the control, on the Ukrainian territory is not the maximum goal, but it's obviously more than it has controlled before 24th of February. The legitimization of Crimea as Russian is an absolute must. So that means that any negotiations will, of course, include this condition by Russia. From Ukrainian point of view, um, practically regaining the territorial integrity in the borders from 1991 is the absolute must. That means the maximum goal would include all of the territory. So we are somewhere in the limbo, right? In military terms, in diplomatic terms, in political terms. And right now, I think that these 3 to 6 months will be very much decisive for the next phase, in which direction we go. Are we going into the direction where Ukraine can really decide at least partial military victories for itself due to the success of the counteroffensive, and then translate that into political, let's say, victory, at least for this moment? Or are we going in the direction that Russia would be able to stabilize the front lines, through massing more and more troops? It is currently in a mass mobilization cycle. And then through, let's say, successful defense strategy, would be able to push practically this, to push away this counteroffensive. A lot of question marks. In fact, more question marks than answers for the moment.
Yeah, and what I find particularly, uh, what's the word I'm looking at? Frustrating for a person like me. Look, I'm no geopolitical expert. I don't claim to be one, which is why I call people like you to explain things, and people from different points of view. Is that everybody has their own version in this? There is the Russian version, and it's not like the European version and the American version are the same either. When I say America, I mean the North American version, primarily being the United States of America and Canada together. And then we have the Ukrainian version. So I'll give you a small example. If I was to ask this kind of a question, even when we are trying to assess the claims of deaths of every side makes kill claims, as they call it in this parlance. So Ukrainians will claim that they have shot X number of missiles down, and it never seems to be consistent with the numbers of missiles that seem to hit their targets. The Russians seem to claim they have hit almost unbelievable number of targets, that they never miss anything, nothing ever goes wrong with the Russian claim. What's exactly happening? Like, it's how does one assess?
Well, of course, military intelligence knows for a fact what is going on the ground. Then, it depends also on what military intelligence is sharing with, let's say, other military intelligence services. For instance, those that are in, partnering countries. Here, I would argue that Russia is very cautious. I've been following Russian wars since the 90s, and there has been always this kind of approach that no numbers are being revealed. No numbers. Starting with the Chechen wars, you could not get any information, even if you are a journalist or an analyst, covering the war. You will get no information. You will practically will look for any kind of piece of information, and then you will just, add numbers of casualties or of injured, number of explosions, and prisoners of war, and so on and so forth. This hasn't changed much, and it makes a perfect sense if you think about the focus of war, because you don't want to put yourself in a disadvantageous position. You don't want to reveal numbers of strength, but also numbers of weakness. That goes in both directions. When it comes to Ukraine, I would argue it's the same thing. Even I would be surprised if Ukraine military intelligence is sharing all the information. We've seen also from the leaked Pentagon documents that there are actually, efforts to, to take a look at what the Ukrainian troops are doing on the ground. What are the numbers of ammunition, of military equipment, and so on and so forth. And that is also understandable because it is a fog of war. And right now, every piece of information can actually well, provide you with an advantage versus your enemy, or actually put you in a disadvantageous position. And we've seen this, by the way, also from the last counteroffensive of the Ukrainian troops, where in fact they managed actually through a disinformation campaign to lure the enemy into the wrong direction, and then actually launched the real counteroffensive in a different in a different direction. So they started with Kharkiv, but then actually the real thing was the counteroffensive in Kherson, in the Kherson region, where in the end around 30,000 Russian troops had to cross over and run away from their positions. So in a sense, what I'm trying to say is that we will make sense of numbers once the war is over. We will be dealing with this kind of folk of war for the whole of the period. We've seen a lot of contradictional actually analysis, and this is unfortunately always the case. This is not currently a kind of exception. This has been happening with other military operations, with other military conflicts everywhere else. But I would argue that this probably is the war that has been most reported, certainly most reported, and has, of course, also probably the largest, let's say, implications in general, because it really considers not only the continent, the old continent, the European continent. It really has ramifications for the rest of the world in geo-economic terms, when it comes to commodities, when it comes to dependencies, when it comes to prices, and so on and so forth. So this, of course, makes it also more interesting. I would say for a lot of observers around the world. And not to forget, in the end, it is also because of China, because China is, for probably the very first time in its, let's say, last 20-25 years of international politics, when Beijing's stance has been continuously let's say, improving and growing. I mean, improving is probably not the right word in qualitative terms, but from Chinese point of view, it has been growing the portfolio, the diplomatic portfolio. And right now, this is probably the peak from China's point of view. And China is not neutral in this war. So China has a very, very clear stance. And this, I think, makes really the covering of this war different from others, from other military conflicts, from other, let's say, military tensions, because of the scale. And final point, yes, we've seen also that there is a huge difference right now, contrary to previous wars, when it comes to the open source information, because we have a lot of open source information companies, analysts, and so on, working with the raw material, providing raw material on a daily basis. Not all of this material, not all of this information can be verified, and yet it creates a lot of, let's say, exposure. We understand a lot thanks to this really live coverage of the war, that I think is unprecedented. And that's why the first books are already appearing. That tells you a lot. I mean, in the middle of the war, we are already actually having the first books on the war. And yes, and in a sense, we have seen, for instance, just to give you an example, with the leaked Pentagon documents, that a lot of the data by this open source information, companies, firms, analysts, has been actually verified by the leaked documents. So in a sense, I would guess the truth is somewhere in between. You have to be very cautious when it comes to reporting. By the way, it's the same goes for the mass media. They are also struggling to catch up and to provide material on spot. But at the very same time, you have to just verify, and you really have to take a look at from all possible angles. And that goes back to the previous question. You have to really take a look at every country's perspective. you cannot cover the war by just relying on, let's say, the Western perspective, the European one or the American one. You have to take a look at what, what is China's stance, what is, what are other partners of Russia actually thinking about the war. Take the example of, the visit of the Brazilian president to China. Take the example of African leaders making statements. That is the way forward. You just have to really refer to all of the informations coming from third parties as well.
Now, on this entire coverage bit, I actually do agree with you that the Chinese coverage has a slant, but I think everybody's coverage has a slant in that sense, like, till the extent that when this conflict started officially a year or so ago with the Russian invasion. In fact, one of the most glaring things that I could observe. Even in the coverage in the Western media, for that example, I mean, I don't care. I mean, I can take names here. I mean, whether it was CNN or I'm just using CNN as an example here. Um, it's unbelievable the kind of rhetoric that was coming, and the not just the rhetoric, the moral preaching that comes along with it, and some sort of a moral panic too at times, where there were news of the level of rhetoric was so high. I remember a gentleman, I think he was a Russian origin American. He had a restaurant in the United States of America. The poor guy had to remove Russia from his restaurant name. He literally had to scrape it out because the level of propaganda in Western art. I'm not saying they're the only ones who do it. Believe me, everybody is doing it, which is why people like me who literally don't understand which side of the aisle I'm supposed to look at, I find it. Or in Canada, there was a Russian pianist who had gone there and he was not allowed to perform. Or a tennis player that I like a lot. He's one of the top 5 tennis players from Russia in the world, and he was not allowed to participate in Wimbledon. So it's not like, so how am I supposed to like take the Western coverage either? And why, I'll tell you, am I coming at this is Ambassador Sybil, as I was telling to you offline, wrote this piece recently where he was basically taking the mickey out of the Indian media, saying that the Indian media has no representative in the war zone, in the conflict zone. They just take reports that are culled and presented from the West, and they cut, copy, paste it and put it on the Indian news front as if that's the real reportage. So what do you make of this entire thing?
Well, it's becoming increasingly dangerous for war journalists as we used to know them from the last 30 years, going to the battlefields, reporting on the ground to actually cover the stories. We've lost several actually war journalists covering this war, and as in every war, unfortunately, the tragic part is that they have skin in the game by covering actually the battlefields, and it is simply too dangerous to send journalists, and to some extent irresponsible to send journalists on the ground, especially when it comes, to fighting that very much reminds us of even of the first conditions from the First World War. I mean, just Google, take a look at YouTube documentaries, scenes from the First World War, the trenches from the First World War, to just get an idea what is really going on and how it is being fighted. So that, of course, makes the job, the task of journalists, and here, of course, I mean work journalists, very, very difficult. And at the same time, yes, if you take a look at the media coverage, you will find out that there is a lot of recycling of, one and the same story. So it's a lot about storytelling with a carefully prepared narrative rather than, reflection of reality, trying to really present a piece of reality the way it is and not the way how the author wants us to think about it. And I think this is the major problem that you will find in every country, whether it is in India or it is, in a European state or in United States right now. I mean, by the way, United States is not. I mean, if you take a look at what is going on right now on the ground, where the preparations for the election campaign are already running, you will find out that there are a lot of different opinions and different views on the war, and that specifically the Republicans are not necessarily, the core with what Biden's administration was doing in terms of financial aid, in terms of military aid. So here, once again, depending on which American channels you are watching, you will find very different. You will see a very different perspective, and you will actually hear a very different narrative. So I argue that, of course, media coverage is a lot about creating narratives and then, carefully preparing stories and then disseminating the stories. And it has less to do with really presenting the facts on the ground. But that same goes for China, countries such as China and Russia. You will not, once again, I have to stress that you will not really, uh, let's say, see and hear the real version of of the developments or of the events. So once again, it is very, very difficult, specifically when it comes to closed systems such as the one of China and Russia, to report on the ground. uh, in Russia, just to give you one example, if you go on the streets or if you make public statements that this is a war and not a special military operation, because the public narrative, the narrative by Russia is that this is a special military operation. Now go on the streets and try to say that, or let's say use a media platform to say that. You could actually face up to 14 years jail just
Whoa.
questioning for questioning the narrative that is
So,
that this is actually not a special military operation. Not to speak of China, where of course we know how China reacts to certain issues, specifically, for instance, when it comes to minorities rights and so on. um, we don't have a general story here. We don't have a general formula. This is what I'm trying to say. I myself actually take a look at all possible channels and try to compare and um, well let's say verify the information. I take a look at Russian channels. I take a look at the disinformation channels on Telegram. I take a look at the Ukrainian media coverage. Then I take a look in original, of course. I take a look at a lot of different languages. So I use different languages and I compare as well. And then of course we have obviously our own channels of information exchange, where I can also listen to other experts and colleagues, how they view things. Like, if there is a call between Xi Jinping and the Ukrainian President Zelensky, you will find 10 different versions, like 10 different readings of this call. And this is also important. So in the end, there is no general formula, and you will not have one. And it is up to the people, how they will perceive based on their level of preparedness, level of information, level of how deep they can go into the stuff, how they will work with this information. But to expect from us media to give you information that actually is already distilled into analysis, into a serious analysis, is I think not serious. I mean, it's not realistic.
yeah, I'll just make one comment. For me, the most hilarious bit in the entire American media landscape was the change at the political level, where during the Obama administration, it was the Republicans who were like, we should be soft on Russia. And then suddenly everything has changed. So they're like, the Biden administration is super hard on Russia, and the Republican side, you have Fox News. I remember Tucker Carlson. Now he's no longer with Fox News. Tucker's going like, "Why are we doing this? What has this got to do with us?" I don't understand American. I mean, it's like the flavor of the season for Americans. They take a rose petal. She loves me. She loves me not. She loves me. She loves me not. And then whatever is left in the end, they go by their interest. But it doesn't mean that the Russians don't do it. I think the Russians do it, and like you, I think you're right. I mean, they do it far worse. But it is what is it. I may not find a lot of lovers in the Indian side for saying that the Russians do it far worse. But oh well, who cares? It's just my personal opinion. I never really bothered about people liking me. And I don't understand the whole propaganda wars, is what I'm trying to say. But there is also one side that nobody talks about it, that is the problem of Nazism in Ukraine, in that sense, whether it's a glorification of Bandera, the mob justice meted out to Russian civilians. We've seen videos of some Russians being tied naked in the cold. And again, when it is done, oh, this is Russian state media propaganda. Like, why? My question, Velina, is, can we have an empathetic, like, we can empathize with average people without tarnishing everything as Russian propaganda, right? We could do that. I mean, I remember in 2017, 2016, 2018, the same New York Times would write articles about Nazism being a problem and corruption being a problem in Ukraine. I mean, not that I'm a fan of Candace Owens, another right wing commentator in America. The funniest bit was when the New York Times reached out to her because she was suddenly pro Russia and anti Ukraine. And somebody asked her, what is your source? It was the New York Times writing to her. And lo and behold, she quoted the New York Times and said, "This is my source because I read you guys." So how do we make this? Like, can we not empathize with average Russians too and criticize this?
Now, these are many, many questions, and none of these questions actually refers to my expertise as a geopolitical expert. So I will make it very, very short because I usually do not give answers, that are not derived from my expertise. I can give you my opinions if you like, but this will be just my personal opinions that I don't think that the audience will be so eager to, listen to, because they are really real experts covering actually far right movements, right wing far right movements in Europe. Not only in Ukraine, we have a huge far right wing movement in whole of Europe, and actually not only in Europe, right? It's a world phenomenon. Hasn't ceased to exist actually since the Second World War, and these experts have done amazing job. They have really studied the structure, the content, the way how they have actually been functioning, the propaganda material, the networks. A lot of these things are interconnected, and there is a really long history going back to many decades that points also to strong interest on behalf of Russia to fund and promote these far right wing movements, parties uh, in Europe, for an obvious reason, because from time to time, when there is a crisis, and Europe has a lot of them, movements like this are actually gaining, political importance. They are being, let's say, elected into parliaments, and then you have a vehicle for political influence, and practically you have someone, a player, a stakeholder that you can control, and then you can steer political processes, because we are democracies. We are like an open box of chocolates, and you can pick chocolates, and when this chocolate is no longer tasty, you can also pick other chocolates, like you can actually pick also left wing movements and then work with them as well. What is the difference with the right wing, and the left wing? Well, left wing are actually strongly anti-American. So you work on the strong anti-American sentiment, and the right wing, they are very nationalistic or nationalistically oriented. Then you work on their fears because of migration, how Europe will be swept by migrants coming from all over the world, 450 million aging population. on this old continent, they will not make it into this century without really without migration. This is the reality that no politician will tell you, because they cannot win elections by telling you the simple truth, and that is that Europe needs a lot of migrants from everywhere in the world. And like smart powers have been doing this, whether this is United States or Canada or Australia, you see that this is actually working. And this gives you a leverage, a demographic leverage that Europe doesn't have. Because in the next 10 to 20 years, all the boomers will be retired. We are having already labor shortages, and we cannot cover for them. So you can imagine what will be in like 10 to 15 years, not to speak of the famous welfare system here in Europe, that means retirement, social, healthcare, and so on and so forth, that once again needs to be covered, because you don't have the babies, and you don't have actually the the people who will be in charge for, let's say, one baby who should be in charge for like 3 to 4 retired person. So going back to the story, you understand that it's much easier to operate on the ground of a democratic system. You can actually launch NGOs, you can buy interest groups, you can actually invest into interest groups that are propagating certain campaign. Like for instance, on the side of the left wing, I would even say partially Marxist oriented, groups. You can start investing into these groups that are strongly, in favor of climate change, fighting the climate change, right? So going against fossil fuels, deindustrializing, speeding up the process of, energy transition, so on and so forth. So you have a leverage. And as I said, you can also work with the nationalistic sentiments of many, many, people who are afraid of different, opinions, migrants, as I said. Every time when you use this, and do not forget that before this war began, we had an perfectly instrumentalized migration crisis at the borders of Poland and the Baltics. With the help of Belarus, they tested the ground. It worked perfectly. And you have, what do you have actually in Poland? In Poland you have a, strongly nationalistically oriented government. They saw actually how they can channel the migrants from countries like Syria, like Afghanistan. You cannot really seriously expect that country like Belarus will have the networks on the ground to facilitate the movement of migrants from countries like Syria or Afghanistan without Russian help. Because we know for a fact that, Russia is militarily present in Syria, has been actually on the ground since 2015, and at the very same time it has closely coordinating with China on the ground in Afghanistan, prior to the withdrawal of the US troops, already 6 to 9 months before that, even though that the Taliban are on the list on the Russian list as a terrorist organization. They have been talking to them and coordinating with them. So going back to your question, yeah, does Ukraine have a Nazi problem? By no means a Nazi problem that has any significant political meaning. So that means Ukraine, as every other European state, and that means also Russia, and that means every other European state, has a problem with far right or right wing movements that can, from time to time, become also a political factor. And just as we speak, in my country, in Austria, we have a huge right wing problem, huge one. In the largest province, there has been a local election in the largest province in the federal state of Austria. Austria is a federal republic. They won 12% more as compared to the last time. Now there has been a second local election in another province. Once again, they won by 8% more. By the way, the Communist Party won another, like they gained around 20% more. Like they gained 12-13%. They entered the local government for the very first time since 1947, since the end of the Second World War. So you see that things are much more nuanced. And here, this party, why is it important and why am I giving you this example? Because this party has actually signed a contract with Russia years ago. And this is something that is being debated again and again in the Austrian parliament, that the only party that is in the is in the Austrian parliament is right now in the opposition, and probably the next time when there is election here in Austria has big chances to even become party number one, or even elect the next chancellor here in Austria. So you understand that this is a leverage, and things are very, very nuanced. So maybe I will finish here by telling you that um, you need to understand that these are specifically the Eastern European countries. They haven't had any chance to emancipate as nation states, going from Second World War and then becoming part of a big union, Warsaw Bloc, and then some of them also being part of the Soviet Union. They have never had the chance to emancipate and to actually work on these things. And then the collapse of the Soviet Union happened. Did you think that 30 years is anything in the history of a nation? I mean, take the example of India. Since 1947, this is a gradual process of a nation building, of a proud nation building, in which rediscovering and re-emerging. India is now on the rise, like many experts are saying right now. India is re-emerging as a power in the global arena. So here I argue that this will be a process. It will take time, and once again, it will very much depend on the outcome. But it is the Russian president who actually led to the birth of the Ukrainian nation, of the Ukrainian identity, not based on a far right ideology, based on a national ideology, to differentiate yourself from someone else. And that means, of course, to have an opposite, which is Russia, and to be the opposite of it, of Russia, which is now Ukraine.
Fair enough. Now, I want to touch upon your essay in the Observer Research Foundation from March 2nd, 2023, where you talk about Europe on the verge. So, how do you think Europe handles this? So, I want to quote the beginning paragraph where you say, as Europe continues to grapple with Russia's ongoing war against Ukraine, the prospect of devastating cascading effects looms on the horizon. Western military experts assess that Moscow's multifaceted approach encompasses three distinct yet interconnected dimensions: a military aggression against Ukraine, a war against Western values, norms, and standards, and non kinetic war targeting the European economy through the weaponization of commodities. Now, I want to. I think we have kind of dealt with one and two. Let's focus on number three. How long do you think Europe, and when I say Europe, I specifically want to focus on Western Europe, how long can they sustain this thing, and would they not be interested in pushing Ukraine to get on the table to negotiate with the Russians? Because at the end of the day, the one part of the world that has had a disproportionate economic impact because of this conflict going on right now, other than Russia, is actually the entire Western European area, right?
So this is the big question mark that I've been dealing with since the beginning of the war. I am absolutely on the minority with this statement. The bottom line of this statement has been right from the beginning of the war that this war has not been only waged against Ukraine, but in fact Russia had a very strong interest, and I can explain why. I mean, from Russia's point of view, it makes perfect sense to launch this non-kinetic war targeting actually the European security and economic order. Non-kinetic means obviously a war that is undeclared, because it is being waged by non-military means. You target certain dependencies. You know for a fact in advance how your enemy will react, because we Europeans are like an open book, as I said, not only because our democratic societies are really this, as I said, box of chocolates, open box of chocolates. Everyone can, take, you open the box and take a chocolate. but also, well, because we are quite predictable, given the limitations of our approach. First critical component is that Europe was not able to prevent the war from happening. This is a hardcore conclusion. It really hurts, but this is a conclusion that European political decision makers have to deal with. And if you take a look at the reactions coming from various Western leaders, let's focus on the Western leaders, right? Uh, they were quite wrong with the diagnosis, with their approach, and even now, with to some extent, with the way how they are, coping with the war. The diagnosis, um, the realization that they needed actually a geopolitical rapprochement with Russia prior to the war. I mean, many forget that countries like France and Germany were in a very, very deep geopolitical approximation of of the relations, of the bilateral relations with Russia. There was a strong conviction that they needed Russia to actually cope with the rise of China in the global affairs. That was, the bottom line. And if we take a look what was happening in the last, let's say, 20-25 years, there has always been a Russia first policy in Western Europe, and also in the capital of the European Union, Brussels. So all big European policies towards the eastern neighborhood were first and foremost about Russia, and then about the rest of the countries. How this did this actually, end up? Well, like I said, this rapprochement did not prevent the war from happening. The whole, the many hours of phone calls, the personal meetings ahead of the beginning of the war with Macron, with Merkel. Uh, Previously, before that, the European Union top diplomat went to Moscow, was also humiliated by Lavrov. Uh, it did not end well. I mean, it was a clear and strong signal that things were not going, in the direction that they were, they wanted to shape things. So wrong diagnosis, wrong perceptions about the realities. When you are this normative player, when you really only think of the way how you look at the world, and you don't understand your counterpart, you don't understand the calculus, you don't understand the rationale behind actions, you will end up by being punched in the face, by reality. And this is what happened on the 24th of February. The very fact that even now, as we speak, there are different understandings about how to approach Russia, but also how to approach China, points to this, what I was describing as bifurcation, growing bifurcation of Europe. Europe being fragmented and split based on geopolitical and geoeconomic interests. When it comes to the relations with key players in the world, when it comes to the relations with the United States on the one hand, and when it comes to the relations with Russia and China on the other hand. And here, once again, we see that now countries like France and Germany are shifting towards geopolitical rapprochement with China. They called it, Brussels called it de-risking, economic and diplomatic de-risking, because they don't like the word decoupling. Why they do not like the word decoupling? Because they don't want, to stop doing business with China. But at the very same time, they want to, remain strategic partner of the United States. So geopolitical rapprochement with China in order to cope with Russia. So you see once again where the problem lies. The problem lies, namely, in the fact that they will further enable, China's rise, because China needs to convert its geoeconomic clout into geopolitical power projection. This is what China is now eager to do, especially given, the new circumstances. So going back to the wrong diagnosis, not understanding of the realities, why is it important? Why did I claim that, it is in Russia's interest to start a non-kinetic war? Because Russia didn't see itself as a benefiter from this economic and security order. It saw that, European Union was successfully enlarging, has been successfully enlarging for the last 3 decades, and there were more countries, direct neighbors of Russia, that wanted to join the European Union, wanted to become part of the European Union, with the most successful story of it, which is to become part of the common market. Because once you become a common, part of the common market, all the tariffs, everything, goes down, and you have a significant economic boost. Your society has to undergo reforms, has to democratize. You have a concept on which you build. You have the democratic, political order. You have the free liberal market, and then you have, society based on human rights and freedoms. Russia cannot afford itself having this model, which is a counter model to the Russian model, next to its border. And if I give you just one example, Poland and Ukraine were at the same level of economic development just 30 years ago. 30 years ago, when Poland started entering applying for European Union membership, they were at the same level of development. Yeah, which was obvious. Think, I mean, the one is, and the other have a similar, size, scale, population number, and so on and so forth. Meanwhile, you take a look at where Poland is and where is Ukraine. So imagine to have such a winning formula from Ukrainians' point of view, and this is next to the border of Russia. It's impossible to allow it. That is the Russian calculus. It is the main, of course, goal is still to prevent this enlargement, which has been described by Moscow as expansion. But expansion, you need to understand that in geopolitical terms, expansion means that you need military means, to apply military means to actually expand territorially. And this is what Russia is doing right now. This is the push to expand, Russia, to take away actually the whole of Ukraine, to subjugate Ukraine. And by doing so, and here we arrive at this non-kinetic, you practically destroy automatically the security architecture from the last 30 years, because you have suddenly a new geopolitical reality. You have a geopolitical bloc. Ukraine is part of Russia. Then you have a union with Belarus. You place nukes, on Belarusian soil, and there you go. You have a very different, demographic, economic model, and you have a very different regional power projection. So all of this, of course, will lead also to new economic realities. And then you pointed out, of course, in democratic societies, it is up to a government to run for the next election. So everyone is a candidate for the next election. We saw that already with some of the European Union members, that they, even though that they actually reflected on the interests of their own population, like it was the case with, with Finland, the prime minister was not re-elected. After she was very, very, strong in terms of messaging, in terms of, communication, and it was the Finnish population that wanted to actually for Finland to apply for NATO membership, but still this did not translate into a political result. That means that she was not re-elected as a prime minister, and this is because every war is inflationary. Every war is inflationary, and Europe was already in a state of energy crisis before actually the war began. And the serious situation of commodities prices was already at place before the war began. So months before, we had already this precarious geo-economic environment with commodities prices skyrocketing, energy crisis looming on the old continent, all of these issues that I was actually outlining for you. And then you suddenly have the decision on a full-scale war. You can imagine the scale, you can imagine the effect of this decision on all the commodities prices, and how actually these dependencies, knowing for a fact how Europe will react, will play out. But there have been three, and this is the final remark, have been three major miscalculations by the Russian president. Even though that he could factor in a lot of these variables correctly, there have been three major miscalculations. The first being the real um, cap- cap- capabilities and capacities of the Russian army on the battlefield. The second being the will to fight and the real capabilities of the Ukrainian army, which has been already in a state of war for the last 8 years. Practically all of the Ukrainian troops have been already, fighting against, the Russians in eastern Ukraine. And third point, the reaction of the West, because from Putin's point of view, he was expecting something similar to happen as in 2014. Some kind of sanctions, a little bit being outraged, and then, behind the curtains, the message would be, let's go back to business because we have all of these dependencies in fossil fuels, in food commodities, fertilizers, big issue. Let's go back to business. This was the message. This was the message after Georgia's war in 2008. This was the message after the first invasion of Ukraine. This was the message after, Russia intervened militarily in Syria against the Western interests. Let's go back to the business. And here, the big miscalculation was that this time, there is no coming back. But now, of course, we can debate that in the end, there will always be a possibility, for coming back, depending on which political forces are going to regain, let's say, certain importance thanks to elections. We have all of these players in countries like France, in countries like Germany. I gave you the example of Austria. So um, once again, it depends on election cycles, and we may end up here in Europe with political forces that will be eager to, let's say, stop the war by actually stopping the aid to Ukraine, and by cozying up to Russia once again, as they did before in the past. Most of these countries, and specifically countries like France, Germany, Austria, they have former ministers, former chancellors sitting in all these, big boards of Russian state companies. So this is how you create a leverage in democratic societies, by buying up politicians, by buying up interest groups, by investing in NGOs, by penetrating society, suffocating the economic vitality, and infiltrating the political process of these countries. It is not up to Russia to not do it. Of course, it will always try to do it. It is up to the Western, leaders to prepare their societies, to strengthen their institutions, to engage with political stakeholders, industries, and economies, and most importantly, bureaucracies, and to create, strong resilience, which is not happening for a moment. So we are not, we are not beyond that. We are in the middle of the storm, and I argue that this specific season, this second winter season, if we don't get the mild winter, which was another big miscalculation by the Russian president, because he was betting, on the winter to accelerate these processes that I'm outlining for you. If we don't get the mild winter, if European countries do not cut off, reduce demand, energy demand by another 15, maybe even 20%, this is just the calm before the storm.
Fair enough. Then, listen, the interesting bit is like, what is the future course then? Before I, take a few audience questions, like, where do we end? How long can Ukraine be sustained too? Because I don't know, history has shown Russia has a lot of resilience. They tend to be a resilient society. Uh, I- you cannot say your heart can't go out for the poor Ukrainians because the war is just pummeling them. And then on the other side, as you rightfully said, Western Europe, commodity prices are a real thing. The cost of living in Western societies has hit the roof, proverbially. It's I mean, how long do you think, let's say, you have an election happening in the United States of America. What if a Republican comes to power? The Republican is going to stop the aid to Ukraine then. So where does Ukraine go in all of this in the future? Or you think it's going to be a year and then electoral results are settled and then maybe we can finally come up to a conclusion?
Oh, yes, I think that it's a war of attrition par excellence. It's going to last for years, certainly for years, and we will have breaks, we will have ceasefires, we will have rounds of negotiations. But you name some of the variables, some of the unknown unknowns, where you see that um, there are more questions for the moment rather than answers, and without having these answers you cannot really point to a clear scenario. What we know for a fact is currently the West is comprehensively supporting Ukraine with military aid, with financial aid, humanitarian, political one. We know that for a fact. That has been the most, like I said, the most comprehensive support for the last 400, almost 30 days. Now, depending on the new realities, political realities, we may see some shifts. But let's wait. For instance, let's wait for the Republicans first to win, because this is a major question mark. Then let's wait for the Republicans to be faced by reality, because this is the next thing. When they have to actually this bipartisan support for U.S. policy towards China, and when they see, for instance, that China is actively supporting Moscow, once they are witnessed with the realities on the grounds, which from US perspective are, look very differently from what I've been describing from Europe's point of view. And that is that America by no means wants to be engaged in a, like I would say, dual front scenario, having to support Ukraine for a long run, having to remain militarily engaged on the old continent while preparing for the big competition with China in the Indo-Pacific. This is no go. This is not the scenario America wants, which is why we saw this very strong response from Biden's administration. Surprisingly, by the way, nobody was expecting that. And by the way, we saw also a very strong, I would argue, I myself was very surprised by that response to China unexpectedly. So, on the other hand, of course, we've covered a little bit the West, a lot of question marks here. I think that the biggest breakthrough should be for the European powers to say that not only do they support Ukraine to win the war, but they support Ukraine to regain its sovereignty and territorial integrity per internationally recognized borders from 1991. These are the borders that Russia actually recognized. The 1991 borders. So here you have the next big question mark, and that is Crimea, because from Russia's point of view, Crimea is the absolute red line. From symbolic point of view, from psychological point of view, and obviously also from military point of view. And again, if you take a look at the reports from the Ukrainian military intelligence, the ones that are being made public, the interviews, Ukrainian military intelligence is convinced that Ukraine can regain Crimea. Big question mark. Is it going to be tolerated? What will be the Russian response? The issue of the nuclear blackmail, the issue of the threat of the use of tactical nuclear weapons. There you go, right? And then a final remark, it will be also, I think, very important what the long-term stance of China will be. I mean, we know for a fact, from geopolitical point of view, China cannot afford itself the emergence of three-front scenario. So you have the military escalation in the Strait of Taiwan, you have the military tensions with India along the line of control, and these military tensions are destined to grow, unfortunately, because of the re-emergence of India as an economic power, with a lot of economic growth, a lot of deviation of capital, supply chains towards India. away from China. I mean, this is just the recipe for let's say a big political clash, geopolitical clash that will result in some kind of military tensions, and we have also the military buildup on both sides. And then imagine that under this circumstances, these are the current circumstances, you have suddenly a security vacuum in the north of your border, your longest border with Russia that has been demilitarized, demarcated, so you don't have any issues with Russia. You need actually predictability, you need stability, this is what you need. And actually, so long as things are, let's say, kept under control, in fact, you are one of the winners of the war, so long as Russia keeps the West busy on the old continent, because you can prepare for the big competition in the Indo-Pacific, from China's point of view. So here another variable will be if, let's say, Russia continues experiencing difficulties on the ground, if China decides to start providing military aid to Moscow, because this will turn the war into a classic proxy war between two major systemic rivals, China and the United States, both supporting two parties, two conflicting parties on the ground for years. You see, we have this kind of scenario. Of course, there is still the possibility that a black swan kind of event happens, something really unpredictable, that, for instance, leads to certain kind of chain of reactions that could, for instance, cause an economic explosion. For the moment, this is not realistic because Russia relies on partners such as India, such as China, such as UAE, Turkey. So there is no way how Russia can be internationally isolated in terms of trade and in terms of economy or even currency. But then again, something unpredictable can always happen, right? We have a lot of rumors, once again, even through the leaked Pentagon documents, where we've seen some information about the health issues of the Russian president. This would not be a black swan because obviously it's being expected by many, but it is something that obviously is on the agenda, can happen. What would this kind of event mean for the system? How will the system in the Kremlin keep itself afloat? How will it accommodate with the different actors, be it the military, be it the oligarchs, be it Western partners, and so on? Then again, the variable of the European economic order, if things continue, being in a permanent crisis, what will be the political effect of it? What will be the outcome of it? And how will this actually affect the decision making on Ukraine? So the moment when we know for a fact, as of today, if Russia now decides to stop the war, nothing will happen. The war will be over. There will be no consequences, more or less, for Russia. But if Ukraine stops the war now, like it says, for any particular reasons, for most of which would be that there is no military aid anymore, then Ukraine will be subjugated. There will be no way, if Ukraine cannot fight, cannot further fight, that there is no way how Ukraine would sustain the Russian attacks, that Ukraine would be able to further exist, at least in those territories that are already under Russian control. And I would argue that Russia then will make a move to seize more territories.
Fair enough. Now let's get into the viewer questions. First, there are 2 3 portals I have to look at, so I'll first look at Patreon. So on Patreon, somebody has started with this question. So what do you make of Finland and Sweden? I think Finland has joined NATO officially, right?
Finland has already joined NATO. There is a decision to join and has joined officially. And Sweden awaits the decision by Turkey and Hungary. And the decision by Turkey is more, is politically complicated, but in fact, I argue that it has a lot to do with the election. So the moment when the election will be over in Turkey, and this is going to happen in May, I think that this will be solved as well. So Sweden and Finland will be fixed members of NATO. And this is for you another example about Russian narrative, because Russia used the narrative. The Russian president stated on television in his first public statement that he launches this limited military operation to prevent NATO expansion. And in reality, two neutral countries for the last 200 years respectively, since the end of the Second World War, decided. So it was not the government, it was not the political parties, it was the population in these countries that pushed their governments for a membership. And in fact, by launching this full-scale war, Putin actually accelerated the process. He gave new meaning to NATO as a collective defense alliance, a meaning that went from being brain dead, as stated by the same French president Macron a few years ago, to becoming even bigger organization. And I argue personally that Ukraine was invaded not because it was striving for NATO membership, but it actually because it was not a member of NATO.
Yeah, I agree. I kind of agree with that point of view. And well, they called Russian bluff. I think didn't Putin say that, oh, if these two countries join NATO, I'll consider it as a act of aggression or something. Well,
Nothing happened.
booyah. Yeah, booyah is all I can say. I mean, like I said, I got my money on no one in this fight. I could care less. I just look at all this and I was like, my gas prices are high. Do something about it. That's all I can. That's how I look at it. Just a common man's perspective. All right. So somebody has asked a very specific question: if right to protect could be invoked in Bosnia and Kosovo, why can't Russia invoke that same concept to protect civilians in the Donbass bracket? Over 14,000 killed between the 2014 annexation of Crimea and the 2022 start of the war.
And protect whom exactly? Millions of displaced persons, millions of people actually fled from this, from Donetsk and Luhansk when, the first invasion happened in 2014. Millions of refugees fled to Europe or went to other parts of Ukraine. Protect whom exactly? Imposing Russian passports on a sovereign territory? Like, imagine that tomorrow there is, that China decides to, decides to launch Chinese passports in the China's controlled part of Kashmir. Right to
Mhm.
protect, right? I mean, here the thing is that we should refrain from generalizations, in a sense that there is a lot of whataboutism. What about what United States did? Yes, what United States did has been reported and reflected on thousand of pages. You can go everywhere, you can comment everywhere about what these people did or not did, right? Did any of these territories go to the United States? Did United States seize these territories? Just as an example. All of these things can be critically, dealt with. People lost their jobs, people lost elections, and so on and so forth. People went publicly and started apologizing for the big mistakes they did. Europeans were very much against it. Remember how many million of people went to protest against the Iraq war, against Afghanistan, and so on and so forth. So a lot of these processes are being actually still processed, and you have plenty of material to do so. Now imagine, like I said, imagine going to Russia and criticizing how Russia is conducting the so-called military operation, special military operation. Or imagine going there and saying, that this is a war. Or imagine going, to Xinjiang, for instance, and saying, or Tibet, and saying, something about the rights of the minorities there. You understand that this is a big difference. You don't have any transparency. Nothing is going to happen even after the war. What actually happened in the last 8 years on behalf of Russia, how many of these leaders, so-called leaders that were put in place, are long dead. They have been terminated. They are no longer alive. You don't have any information, any way of dealing with these things.
Fair enough. Now let us get into the next question. I'm just asking whatever the viewers have mentioned over here. What do you make of the nationalism when it comes to Russia, even after the Cold War, and this entire process? Like, are there any surveys done as to do average Russians actually support the war? I mean, well, actually, how can you do the survey? They won't allow it to happen over there. And would the EU slash West and Russian relations ever improve after this entire, what word do I use? Mess?
Yes,
I was being polite by calling it a mess.
starting from behind. Yes, there will be a reconciliation process. There will be a process of approximation between Europe and Russia, between Ukraine and Russia. Once Ukraine wins, it will be for the good of the Russian people. Just take a look. Meanwhile, there are channels which provide you with the information. If you have the patience and if you have really the guts to follow these TV discussions every evening, there are meanwhile translations in English, and they make it public for people around the world to really follow what the public discussions or first channel, second channel are about every single evening. What kind of propaganda you are fed with, every day. So it is how to say, uh, it is a very different information environment, information flow, and this is not new. It has been actually known from the time of the communism, from the time of the Soviet Union. Controlling the information flows is critically important. And this is something that Russia has mastered. And by the way, China has been copy pasting a lot with the help of the new technologies. This is, if you have a population, a lot of which actually doesn't live in the cities, lives in these remote places. Uh, Russia being the largest country in the world, right? And you have only this first channel or only two channels of information. How do you think that you actually build yourself a picture about what's going on, in the world? What's happening in Russia? I mean, think about how Russian young soldiers were entering the Ukrainian villages, small villages, and were shocked by what they found there, like washing machine. For instance, they were like when they were entering, these places of civilians, and they were finding, technical equipment like laptops of some things that they didn't even know how to, work with. These kind of things are realities. The Once again, the discrepancy in the economic development alone from the last 8 to 10 years, specifically when it comes to urban versus village development, is significant. And you understand that, and you need to understand that a lot of Russians are proud of their president, that he is now waging this war, because it is in the Russian DNA to be expansionist. Russian empire has been always an expansionist power. And I argue that this is a reality that we need to accept, and we have to deal with it. So we will deal with Russia from the position of strength. This is how we will deal with Russia. We cannot ignore a neighbor who is there, and will be always, in our direct vicinity. But we can deal with the neighbor from the position of strength. This is the only way, because Russia only accepts force and strength. This is how you can actually be on par with Moscow. So here, I think that you need to understand that, and this is at least my assessment, my geopolitical assessment, is that this war has been the final desperate push for a geopolitical relevance. from Russian point of view as a dying empire, as an empire that hasn't been able to adapt to the new realities economically, in societal terms, hasn't adapted its society, hasn't adapted its army, hasn't adapted, its economy to the new realities, to the new complexities of the world. And is still, applying the same mindset while expecting different outcomes. So at the same time, you see, when you have invested, when you have actually restructured, when you have decentralized, when you have actually different kind of governance, different kind of economic development, different kind of societal contract, as it is the case with Ukraine, you see that this can be a winning formula. And of course, you're fighting for your own survival. You're fighting, actually, you have the will to fight, because it's really about, it's a matter of everything. You have only two options. You have the option of war, or you have the option of subjugation. You will be subjugated. You will become part of something that is Russia, that is called Russia, and it's not going to be called Soviet Union or, Union states. This time, it's going to be really about Russia, reviving the Russian imperialist project, not reviving the Soviet Union, with autonomous republics, with their languages, with their autonomous governance. No, no. This time it's really about all in, having Belarus, Ukraine, and in the next stage, if successful, also getting, incorporating other parts of Eastern European countries, from Georgia, from Moldova, into this bigger Russia. Why bigger Russia? Because for Russia, size matters. Russia needs to reestablish regional, power projection, given the new systemic conflict between United States and China. Given these new realities, Russia sees itself as a front runner. It has to get the pole position in this systemic conflict. It has to become this indispensable power between these two systemic rivals. And every of the two systemic rivals needs to respect Russia, for that matter, because it is becoming a wild card. If China sides with Russia, it will have, let's say, the upper hand. If United States accommodate with Russia, like it did with China in the 70s, it will have an upper hand over China. You see, this is the play. The long game is not about Ukraine. Ukraine is just the vehicle. Ukraine is the necessary, condition. But the, sufficient condition is actually for Russia to reemerge as this, powerful imperial project that has its own sphere of influence on the old continent, that destroys the security order in Europe, creates a chaos, creates a new concert of powers, and accommodates with those powers, like in the Western Europe, that are Russia friendly and will be, eager to go back to business.
So then, from the Russian perspective, this war, it strengthens whom? The intelligence security apparatus, or Silovic faction. Who gains in their idea? Who gets in the pole position? They do, or Putin does, or all of them do? Who does?
Well, from my point of view, this war has been launched by the system itself. The core of, the Russian state is not about oligarchs, or about the Russian Duma, or about, Russian parliamentarians, or, whatever kind of, model of governance you have. It's not about representation of people. It's really about this core that, took over in the last three decades after the collapse. So after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the two major components that remained intact was the international Comintern. I mean, the influence of Russia through various channels and various, networks around the world, based on ideological component, because it was about the Marxism, Leninism. It was about the ideological competition with the United States, but it was based very much on anti-imperialist and anti-American sentiments. And this is something that, they kept and they revived successfully. And the second important component that remained intact was the security apparatus. And this security apparatus slowly but surely took over. So in my view, Putin is just the facade of this system. And if the system decides that it needs to get rid of Putin for the sake of its own survival, it will do it. If it has to sacrifice Putin in order to accommodate with the West, let's say, depending on how, how long Russia will be failing through in this process of war against Ukraine, it will do it. And you need to understand that you don't need a face, you need only to understand the mechanics of the system. And the mechanics of the system is you have a security slash intelligence apparatus that has these strong sentiments about the lost power of the Soviet Union, despised, of course, the Communist Party for, and specifically Gorbachev as, as Russian president, for giving up on the Soviet Union, and is really eager to regain this, as I said, at least regional power projection, understanding very well that Russia has lost its global power status. But Russia can be, as I said, if it is successful in this war against Ukraine, can have the same, can have a pole position, can be a front runner, a geopolitical front runner, can be a wild card in new geopolitical constellations. And this is, I think, the game. I mean, this is something that they cannot do without actually having Ukraine as part of the Russian territory. That's why I'm saying the last old men of Europe, right? If you remember the story about the Ottoman Empire, how long it took for the Ottoman Empire to actually collapse, ultimately collapse. This is now our dying men of Europe. The Russian Empire as a modus operandi, and so long as this system at the core of it is still, being kept afloat, which is the case, I don't think that the Russian people and the Russian state have any chance, of any kind of moving forward, and it's going to be a perpetual kind of modus vivendi of going into war, having talks and then going into war, having talks and going into war. So this is, I think, the most dramatic, the most tragic thing actually of the Russian development over the last 30 years. And you should not equalize it with, with the Russian people. I mean, there have been journalists who have been trying and intellectuals and oppositional leaders who have been trying to fight against it, and you know how it ended every time.
So, what do you make of the whole sanctions on Russia? Do you think the Russian oligarchs have managed to wiggle out of the sanctions successfully, in your view?
I think that meanwhile Russia has a lot of dangerous windows, if you understand what I mean.
Fair
And I
enough.
think that the message has arrived where it had to arrive, because a lot of these, oligarchs, CEOs or whatever, I think they got the message.
Fair enough. Fair enough. All right. So there was. I do not understand this question. I'm just reading it out. I don't understand. Is there any Western indifference towards the war? I don't think so. The West is indifferent to the war. I think everybody's pretty much keyed in the war.
The way I understand it is actually maybe whether people do not, whether there is not kind of a fatigue, right? Fatigue where people want to move on, right? This is a dangerous kind of state where people get used to the war, they no longer want to listen about it, they don't want this war to be covered, and they want to move on. And this is also part of of the democratic process, where citizens in the Western countries, most of the polls are actually showing that there is an overwhelming support from the citizens in all Western countries for Ukraine. Once again, I'm pointing to different trends, I'm pointing to different realities, to different scenarios, but for the moment, let's be very clear that there is a very strong support from also from the citizens in the European countries when it comes to Ukraine. A lot of refugees are still in the Western countries, and a lot of humanitarian help has been also provided. But maybe the question goes more into the direction, second winter, if second winter comes, if this, like I said, winter is tough, it's not mild winter that we had last year, um, and coupled with fatigue, coupled with domestic problems, domestic issues, tackling the repercussions, like I said, so a lot of this perma crisis, a lot of these issues have been already ongoing before the war began. The war accelerated them and amplified them, and how political leaders will be fighting with this. I think that the only way forward is by being honest with the population, being transparent about what is really happening and what is not happening, like in both directions, not promising anything that is not realistic, at the same time communicating, explaining things like I'm trying to explain things on a regular basis, not providing only the one side, providing both sides. What is the one trying to achieve? What is the other trying to achieve? I mean, you need to understand that there is a zero interest on behalf of Ukraine to take any Russian territory. Think about it. Not a single village, not a single millimeter. And at the very same time, we talk about the second largest European country. The second largest, even now as we speak, these 17% are more than the territory of Austria and Switzerland. This is not a small part. This is not just a minor piece of of land. And take a look at what Indian, for instance, troops are doing. The unimaginable at these high altitudes to defend their own territory when it comes to the clashes with Chinese troops. The unimaginable, right? So they are eager to do and defend every millimeter. So how should we expect or let's say tell a country to not defend its territory? So it is going to be, in the end, it is going to be a war between the wills of two people, of the Russian and the Ukrainian, to continue the war. Because if one of the, unfortunately, like in most of the wars, it will be about capitulation. It will be about the inability to, continue fighting. It will be about the will to continue fighting. So in a sense, I think that this is going to be decided by this, by Russia and Ukraine. But the fatigue is something that we need to be aware of it. We need to be vigilant about this kind of, accompanying effects and symptoms.
Fair enough. So you did mention India. Let's end with a question of India. So uh, obviously, it's a simplistic analysis, I think, to begin with, that why is not India not coming with the Western democracies and supporting authoritarians like Russia? Well, India is not supporting Russia. India is not supporting Ukraine. India is basically doing what I think the Indian foreign minister has been very clear on this. And the next part of the question is, why do so many Indians support Putin? Actually, I have not seen any survey that points to that. Indians don't think like, I see Putin, I see Zelensky. Indians don't even care. The Indians only look at Indian interests. And to be very accurate over here is, India has its own geopolitical history. Nobody has forgotten what happened in the 70s, where the Americans did what? I mean, to famously quote Henry Kissinger, what did he say? It may be dangerous to be America's friend, but to be America's enemy, but to be America's friend is fatal. I'm just quoting Henry Kissinger here, nobody else. But India has a history with America. But as far as I understand, Indian American relations have been at its best right now in terms of trade, in terms of many things. I think India is also dealing very well with the Western European nations, but India is not going to stop its relations with Russia. I know a lot of questions come towards India on the question of, oh, why are you buying Russian oil? Well, the Europeans are buying processed Russian oil from us too. So if you're going to ask us that question, why not ask? So the Europeans basically have increased their costs. So it's like, they're not holding their nose like this, but they're holding it like this. But it's the same thing. But what do you make of this entire shenanigan with India? Every time is like chided like a little child. Why are you doing this to me?
So we need another podcast alone for this. Alone for this. for this topic because it's a big topic. And in my scenario assessment ahead of the beginning of the war, because I was already ready with my risk and scenario assessment in December 2021, where I had the international dimension, I had the regional dimension, as I tried to explain it in a very, very obviously very short period of time, and then the national level, right? So in the regarding the international arena, the global arena of competition and cooperation, here I was perfectly clear what India's positioning will be, and that is, as you pointed out, very much oriented and centered around Indian national interests. Now, first and foremost, meanwhile, India already overtook China in terms of population. It is about feeding and providing for their own population. That's it. If you have to feed, meanwhile, 1 point or almost 1.5 billion people, everything that you will decide as a government, as a federal government, will be actually derived from this, ultimate goal. If you have like 9 million people and you are part of a trade bloc with a common market, you obviously have more options, right? So this is the first thing. Second thing, and in here, why is it important? Because Russia is a primal source of fertilizers for India. India being for instance, the biggest producer of wheat in the world, producer of commodities. You need these fertilizers, and you will get them from Russia. This is, you have a solid and predictable source for that. Second important issue, you mentioned that as well. It is, of course, a lot about geopolitics. You have relied on the Soviet support and the Russian support for your stance on the Kashmir issue. You need a clear voice within the UN Security Council, and you need, like I said, predictable support, diplomatic support, geopolitical support on that issue. And this is something that Russia has provided in the past and will provide for you. Now, obviously, this is a factor, it's a variable. It's not, it should not be the most decisive one, but it's a variable. And knowing how, the West has supported Pakistan in the past, and specifically the strategic partnership between the United States and Pakistan, of course, you will be very cautious when it comes to the rapprochement now coming from United States and from European powers towards India. This charm offensive now coming from the West, which is understandable. It has, of course, objective reasons, not only subjective ones. Like I said, India is projected to become world's economic power number 3, probably even in this decade. Contrary to China, has a very optimistic demographic scenario. A lot of labor force, young population, is very, very well positioned in the fourth industrial revolution with the whole digitalization. Is the country with the most digital transactions already in the world. And in fact, United States needs India more to cope with China than India needs United States to deal with China in military terms. That is the reality. So for the upcoming systemic competition in the Indo-Pacific, India, which contrary to European Union and the European powers, is already a security provider, is already a security player, and that means automatically a geopolitical player in the Indo-Pacific. We are struggling to send one frigate or one ship, and except for France and UK, we almost don't have any, any exposure, maritime exposure in the Indo-Pacific. And that means, of course, that the United States will forge new partnerships that cannot bypass India, and we see that already with the Quad, with AUKUS plus. Now Japan is considering, to enter this kind of format, or at least to facilitate a kind of cooperation. And I wouldn't be surprised if India also finds a kind of format of cooperation with the AUKUS, with UK, Australia, and United States as a defense and security pact. So this, of course, comes to show that there are tectonic geopolitical shifts, and India is emerging as a third pole, if you like. It has this traditional non-aligned policy. This time, I think that it's going to be much more difficult for India, being a solid geoeconomic player, to actually refrain from alignments, but it will be very cautious. And I argue that it will be positioned in between, because you see that it is very active when it comes to China-led formats such as Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And this is the right thing to do, by the way, to be there, to be part of the discussions, to listen what is being discussed, to understand the national interests and the rationale, specifically from China, but also BRICS. And also here, once again, you have Russia as a kind of a glue, geopolitical glue between India and China, because both need Russia as a hedge against the other. I mean, the Chinese need Russia as a hedge against the Indians, and the Indians need Russia as a hedge against, the Chinese in regional dynamics. Okay, so here once again you see that India is going to bet on India. Is going to really make sure that it has the economic stability, it has as much of a regional security as possible. So it will be really eager to actually not get militarily involved in any big confrontations, so be it with Pakistan or China, but will be more realistic, more pragmatic about it, because right now economic comes first, security comes second from India's point of view. And at the very same time, India's diplomatic portfolio will be further boosted because it has, a bigger role to play within the global south. Now, I mean, currently it is also chairing the G20. It has hosted a lot of, the ministers from these countries at home. The big summit is coming in September, and it will be organized by New Delhi. So big diplomatic portfolio, bigger role, in the world, a bigger role specifically in Africa, East Territory, South Africa, Indo-Pacific nations. At the very same time, the European Union will also start charming offensive with the FTA, with the free trade agreement. And I think that this is a smart way, and this is a good thing for India as well, to deregulate a little bit, to allow actually Indian labor force to enter the common market, to start actually also capitalizing on geoeconomic relationship with the US, with the European powers. It is a lot about capacity building, a lot about things that will be in the making, will be really, really flourishing in the next decade. A lot of sectors are going to undergo a development, and once again, I mean, it's very nuanced. You cannot have an ultimate reply which points to only one direction. And in the case of India, it's going to be a very, very kind of classic oscillation between blocks, between two blocks building. The world is being fragmented, increasingly fragmented between two blocks: the dragon bear on the one hand, United States, the West on the other, and India. I see India in between, depending on the success, the scale, the speed of its development. First and foremost, economic, technological, digital one, and then of course accompanied by strengthened, enhanced military portfolio. That means, of course, also boots on the ground. India is already participating in a lot of UN missions, and it, like I said, doesn't need the West to fight its wars if necessary. But in a sense, maybe the good story here is to be also a little bit more pragmatic and freed from ideological frameworks, because normalization of relations with Pakistan is such an example. If you create more trade, interdependence, if you actually start working on that channels, you can prevent certain terrorist attacks from happening. You can actually reduce the number of terrorist attacks. You can provide for more stability and more predictability in the relationship, while actually preparing for the big competition with a regional rival, which is obviously the Chinese case. So yeah, once again, why are Indians actually fond of Putin? I think is a question for Indians to answer, but I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, take a look at some of the provinces, the states of India, where you still have a very strong Marxist roots. You have you still have certain regional leaders with quite of a big let's say leverage in influence, and well, the Marxist ideas have been successfully spread to to India during the time of the partnership with the Soviet Union. Like I said, this was also very much on purpose, and the Soviet Union has really provided a lot and helped a lot for this to get also disseminated. And I wouldn't be surprised that there are certain sentiments that have also ideological roots, which is understandable.
I actually have a nuance for you. I have not seen any proper survey done in India on Putin. What the surveys asked Russia. So even after the war, I think there was the Jan 19th report on Times of India, which was on a survey. uh, Indians do view Russia as friendly. It doesn't mean they view Putin as friendly. They just view Russia as friendly, and India has always viewed Russia as friendly because, at the end of the day, there is a historical context to it. But at the same time, when asked out of the five players, right, Russia, US, NATO, Ukraine, don't know. More Indians blame Russia 38%, then US 26%, and NATO 18%. I'm just quoting. This was the morning consult. That was then Russia's popularity when the war started had plummeted, and then it kind of went back to its original position. It did not increase either. So that was there. And then when it comes to India's voting patterns in the UN resolution against Russia, India has consistently abstained uh, in its voting style or voted against at times. And 6 out of 10 Indians support that, but it doesn't translate into India's support for Putin as the person. It's very different. Putin as a personality, and India and Indians look at their national interest. The Indian mind is very clear when it comes to these things. They have a very big memory about, and Indians, while they are very favorable to America now, but I'll be very open. At least my parents' generation, they saw a very different America doing bad things to us during active times. You're not going to expect them to have any favorable opinion in many occasions on many things because they've seen the average person. I'm talking about the 70s when my father was a young man. My father saw what the Americans did by siding with Pakistan. So maybe if you even break it down by age, you'll see young Indians are not very pro Russia. Maybe the older ages. I'll have to look at the numbers, but there is literally no survey on the Putin question. And yes, you are right. Kerala has a communist government. Bengal used to have a communist government. And in India, the Indian academia, especially the academia, is completely hijacked not by left or center thoughts, Marxist thoughts, proper Marxist thoughts. Indian academia is Marxist. It's not just left wing, which is pretty much the trend. The worldwide. I mean, there are surveys that say 90% to 95% of philosophy departments in America not only are left wing, they vote for the Democrats. I'm not the one making this up. Surveys in America say that. So academia, anyways, is left wing. Indian academia is left wing on steroids. They're Marxist. So that's all I can say. But Velina,
That's for the political scientists who are dealing with this kind of very interesting phenomena within societies to deal with and to comprehend. And like I said, these are processes in that needs a long period of let's say reconciliation, of dealing with, coping with, and that is absolutely normal. And you should not forget that in geopolitical terms, nothing is eternal. Nothing is eternal. Neither friends
absolute.
nor enemies. The only eternal thing in geopolitical terms is actually national interests. Whatever serves the national interest, this is what the government will do. This is that's why I said also, once you are confronted with the reality, whether you are a Republican or a Democrat, for instance, if you are sitting in Washington, you will be dealing differently from what you were promising. Same goes for European countries. Same goes for the Indian interest. Same goes for China, for Russia, and so on and so forth. And in a sense, if we understand the core of national interests and how they are actually creating the framework of decision making, we will be, let's say, more realistic about the options, about the scenarios, and also about the limitations of of certain actions.
Yep. I kind of understand nothing is permanent in this world. friendships, especially geopolitically, are always transactional. I say this very openly. I don't believe in the Western idea of a rules based order. There is no such thing as a rules based order, if you ask me. The world is transactional. India is never going to ruin its relations with the West, no matter what people think. The Indian state is very clear. They want the West. They like the West. Average Indians don't have hostility to the West. I mean, you've visited India so many times, Velina. Do you see any hostility when in your
No, not
regular
at all. But
interaction?
how many Indians are queuing to go actually to live in China or Russia? This is the
No
point,
one.
right? And
No one.
how many, I mean, the biggest, the most successful diaspora is in the United States, the most,
Yeah.
the richest one. I mean, if take a look at the table with the graphic with the international diaspora living in United States, the richest one, the most successful story comes from the Indian one. And this is just the beginning of a story, because
Yeah.
once you have the opposite direction of capital flows and investments floating into India, because there is a political backing, and the political backing, by the way, is very real, very real. I mean, I've seen this myself, and I can assure you it's just beginning, and it's not really I think that it's going to be also one of the bipartisan things that we will see, no matter if it's a Republican or a Democrat being elected as a president. So, in a sense, this is what will matter, in my view. Another example: Russia, and this is the final example, because we really we've really challenged the patience of your viewers and listeners by doing almost 2 hours of session. Nobody, this is criminal. Nobody is doing 2 hours podcast after 2.5 years of pandemic, right? But for those who are still with us, here is another example. Russia is the biggest arms sales provider for India, over 50% still, right? And yet there is now this realization that this cannot go on like that, because you cannot make yourself dependent on a sole supplier, be it arms, be it commodities, be it supply chains. This is the realization. This is actually already the realization in the Indian government, that India needs to diversify. So what we are going to see is diversification away from Russia, not because of let's say because the bilateral relationship will undergo a kind of deterioration, but because of the national interests of India to be diversified as a hedge plan, right? This is
Yeah.
the case.
I absolutely agree with you. And Velina, don't worry about it. We can speak for a long time. So I have cultivated an audience that has that has a capacity for long form discussions. So it has always been a pleasure talking to you, Velina. You've been going to Delhi too much. You need to come to my neck of the woods in Mumbai, and we need to sit down sometime. So I'm going to hold you for this one. You better come to Mumbai next time. You always go to Delhi and you go back.
I look forward to invitations to come to Mumbai, actually to coming to Mumbai, because this is obviously, being in Delhi is not everything, is not, telling you the whole story. Absolutely. I'm with you on this. And I hope that one day I will really, really be able to, maybe even this year. Why not? I'm open to any invitations.
Yes. If you're in Mumbai, you're my guest. Dinner's on me.
Deal.
Oh, all right, Velina. Thank you very much. As always, pleasure talking to you and looking forward to another good discussion with you in the future.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
All right, guys, we'll wrap it up. In the description, whether you're watching this on YouTube or Facebook, or you're listening to the audio version on Spotify, iTunes, I've left two links. You can follow Velina on social media, Twitter, and you can also go and check her website out. I think she still offers some specific courses in geopolitics, if I remember correctly from the last time. So you can go and check her website out. All the details are there. And as far as I'm concerned, you know the drill. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and if possible, leave a rating on the audio platforms also. Support this podcast. This is a member driven podcast, so if you can, become a member on Patreon or Fanmo or on YouTube, or buy the merchandise. I'll see you guys next time with another guest. Until then, namaste, take care, bye.